Good morning to one and all. Once again, I welcome all of you on this online teaching platform introduced by Savitribai Phule Pune University Pune and Maratha Vidya Prasarak Samajaj, Srimati Bimlaben Khimji Tejukaya, Arts, Science and Commerce College, Devali Camp, Nasik, through this learning management system. I am Dr. Kiran Rakibe from the Department of English of Maratha Vidya Prasarak Samajaj, Srimati Bimlaben Khimji Tejukaya. Students, in today's session, we are going to talk about sonnet as a form of poetry. Now, before we start the discussion of sonnet as a form of poetry, let us see what we had seen during the previous sessions in the form of a recap. Students, in the last session, we discussed poetry as a form of literature, how poetry is a special genre of English literature. After talking about it, we also talked about the difference between prose and verse, how the language of poetry varies from the language of prose section. Then after that, we also discussed various issues related to language that is specially used in poetry and that also in English poetry. And after talking about it, we talked about different types of poetry which are there in English literature. Now, let us see what we are going to discuss in today's session. Friends, in today's lecture, we are going to discuss sonnet as a form of poetry. So, we are going, you will be able to understand what is a sonnet. After talking about the definition, after discussing about the definition of sonnet, we are also going to talk about the two broad categories of types of sonnets, that is Shakespearean sonnets and Petrarchan sonnet. After talking about the types of sonnets, we are going to discuss the structure, the particular structure of each type of sonnets. So, what kind of structure Petrarchan sonnet is having and what kind of structure the Shakespearean or the English sonnet has. Now, let us see some of the learning objectives, some of the objectives that you are going to achieve, what you are supposed to achieve towards the end of today's session. Friends, towards the end of this session, you will be able to understand sonnet as a type of poetry, sonnet as a form of English poetry. You will be also able to understand various, particularly we are going to talk about the two broad types of sonnets. So, you will be able to understand the difference between Shakespearean sonnet and Petrarchan sonnet, and after that you will be able to understand various features related to English sonnets. Now, let us begin our today's session with the concept of a sonnet. Now, what is a sonnet? A sonnet is a name that is taken from the Italian word sonetto. This word sonnet has been taken from the Italian because the sonnet was for the first time evaluated in Italy. Therefore, this name sonnet has been taken from the Italian word called sonetto, which means little songs. Sonnets are like short songs which has some rhythmic quality. So, a short poem like a song, this name has been taken from the word sonetto. Sonnet, this word has been borrowed from the Italian word sonetto. Now, it is a short song-like poem. Sonnet is a short poem and it has a rhythmic quality like a song. Sonnets can be sung aloud. Sonnets, this type of poetry can be sung by a singer. It can be recited aloud as this is having some rhythmic quality like a song. Now, a sonnet is a 14-lined poem. It is a short poem, but that shortness is within the 14 lines. Each sonnet is written in 14 lines. Any poem that has been written in 14 lines is called as a sonnet. So, this is the special feature of a sonnet as a poetry. A poem that has been written in 14 lines is called as a sonnet. Now, sonnets are written in iambic pentameter. Those 14 lines are written in iambic pentameter. Now, what do you mean by iambic pentameter? Penta means 5. Pentameter means a meter, each line has 10 syllables and each foot consists of 2 syllables. So, Iambic means a foot of two syllables in which first syllable is unstressed and the second syllable is stressed. Unstressed, stressed. This pattern has been followed throughout the poem. Therefore, it is called as iambic. Now, it is written in iambic pentameter. Penta means 5. Each line has 5 feet. Each foot consisting of 2 syllables. Like that, 5 feet into 2 syllables is equal to 10 syllables. So, each line of the sonnet is written, or each line of the sonnet has 5 feet or 10 syllables in it. Therefore, sonnets are written in iambic pentameter. Iambic because the accentual pattern is that unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress, and so on. Now, sonnet has a fixed rhyme scheme. Each sonnet has a fixed rhyme scheme. Each type has its own fixed rhyme scheme, which we are going to discuss in the later part of the session. Now, so this is how you came to know that what is a sonnet. It is a short poem written in 14 lines. Sonnets are written in iambic pentameter and sonnets have fixed rhyme scheme. Now, let us see the history of sonnets. When was the first sonnet written, or how sonnets became popular in English literature? Now, sonnet as a form of poetry, originated in the 13th century. For the first time, 14-line poem was written in the 13th century, but it got a popularity right from the 14th century in Italy. Sonnets got popularized in Italy in the 14th century, but it was introduced in England. It was introduced in English language in the 16th century by Thomas Watt. For the first time, sonnets were written in the 13th century, but it got developed in Italy in the 14th century by Italian poets, and sonnets as a form of poetry became popular in English. It was introduced in England in the 16th century by a well-known poet called Thomas Watt. So, this is the history of sonnets. Even though it started in the 13th century, it got popularized. It got developed in the 14th century, but it got popularized in the 15th and 16th century. Now, after talking about sonnet as a form of poetry, after talking about the definition of sonnets, let us see types of sonnets. Now, there are various types of sonnets. 3 or 4 sonnets have 5 different categories, but in today's session, we are going to discuss 2 broad categories of sonnets, 2 main types of sonnets, which are usually prescribed at various classes. Now, sonnets, these are the 2 types of sonnets. Number 1 is Italian sonnets. Since it was introduced in Italy, it is called as Italian sonnet, and it was the Petrarch, this poet, who introduced sonnets in the 14th century in Italy. Therefore, this type is also called as Petrarchan or Petrarchan sonnets. The first type of sonnet is Italian sonnet, which is also known as Petrarchan sonnet, since this was introduced in Italy by the Petrarch. This was the name of the poet who introduced this type of poetry in Italy. Therefore, the first type of sonnet is known as Italian sonnet. The other name for the same type is called as Petrarchan sonnet. The second type, these are the 2 broad types which we are going to discuss today. The second type of sonnet is called as English sonnets, or the other name, the substitute name to this type is Shakespearean sonnet. Just as it was a Petrarch who introduced sonnet in Italy, therefore, it was named after him. In the same way, it was William Shakespeare who introduced English sonnets after Thomas Watt. Actually, it was the Thomas Watt who introduced sonnet as a form of poetry in English literature, but William Shakespeare made it popularized, made it more famous Therefore, English sonnets were named after this great dramatist. Even though William Shakespeare is known as a dramatist, he also wrote some sonnets, and his sonnets were also popularized. Therefore, the second type of sonnet is named after him, that is Shakespearean sonnets. So, these are the two broad categories of sonnets: Italian sonnets and English sonnets, or Petrarchan sonnet and Shakespearean sonnet. Now, after talking about it, let us see Italian sonnet in detail. What kind of features, what kind of format the Italian sonnet has, or the Petrarchan sonnets have, that we are going to see it. Now, as I have already told you, this Italian sonnet or Petrarchan sonnet is named after Petrarch. It was introduced by Petrarch. Petrarch, this poet, introduced this type of poetry in Italy. Therefore, it is named after him. Now, this particular sonnet has a fixed format. Now, what kind of format it has? Petrarch divided those 14 lines into two halves. 14 lines have been divided into two halves. The first part, the first half of the poetry is called as an octave. First is called as an octave. First 8 lines. The first part consists of 8 lines, which is called as an octave, and the last or the second part, the latter part, which consists of 6 lines, is known as sestet. So, Italian sonnets are written like this, in this format. The 14 lines in Italian sonnets are divided into two broad parts. The first part, which consists of first 8 lines, is known as octave. The second part, which consists of the later 6 lines, is known as sestet. Now, as I have already told you, the sonnets have fixed rhyme scheme. Now, let us see what kind of rhyme scheme the Italian sonnets have. Italian sonnets have this fixed rhyme scheme. The first line which begins with A, and it goes on something like this: A, B, B, A, B, B, A. First 8 lines. First line A, then B, B, then A, B, B, A. 8 lines. And next 6 lines, which is called as sestet, it has the rhyme scheme like this: C, D, E, C, D, E. The sestet, the next 6 lines of a sonnet, which has this particular rhyme scheme. So, sonnets have fixed rhyme scheme. Italian sonnet has the rhyme scheme like this: A, B, B, A, B, B, A. First 8 lines. The second part, which is called as sestet, has the rhyme scheme C, D, E, C, D, E. Fine. So, this is the fixed rhyme scheme. Now, after talking about the Italian sonnet or the Petrarchan sonnet, let us see the format of the English sonnets or the Shakespearean sonnet. Just as Italian sonnets were introduced by Petrarch, English sonnets were introduced by William Shakespeare. Even though it was Thomas Watt who introduced sonnets in England, but it was William Shakespeare who made it more popularized, and therefore it is named after him. So, since it was introduced by William Shakespeare, it is named after him and called as Shakespearean sonnet. Now, just as the Italian sonnet is divided into two parts, is divided into two halves, like that, this Shakespearean sonnet is divided into 4 parts. Italian sonnets are divided into 2 parts, but Shakespearean sonnets are divided into 4 parts, that is 3 quatrains. A quatrain is a stanza of 4 lines. Quatrain is a stanza of 4 lines. So, 3 quatrains means 12 lines and a concluding couplet. Shakespearean sonnet is divided into 4 parts. First 3 parts consist of 3 stanzas, each stanza having 4 lines, therefore it is called as a quatrain. So 3 quatrains and concluding couplet, like this. And like an Italian sonnet, Shakespearean sonnet also has a fixed rhyme scheme, but the rhyme scheme of Shakespearean sonnet varies from that of the Italian sonnet, and it has a rhyme scheme such as AB AB, CD CD, EF EF. These are the 3 quatrains: AB AB, CD CD, EF EF. 3 quatrains, each stanza having 4 lines, and the concluding couplet G G. AB AB, CD CD, EF EF, and a concluding couplet G G. This is the fixed rhyme scheme the Shakespearean sonnets have. Fine. So, in this way, let us see what we have discussed so far in today's session in the form of summary. Now, we talked about sonnet as a form of poetry. So, you must have understood the concept of a sonnet, that it is a 14-lined poem written in iambic pentameter and it has a fixed rhyme scheme. This idea you might have got from today's discussion. After that, you also came to know various features of a sonnet. After talking about the types, we also talked about the features, that it has a fixed rhyme scheme, it has 14 lines, and it has 2 types. Broadly, 2 categories or 2 types sonnets have. We discussed the types of sonnets, format of sonnets, that how Italian sonnet varies from Shakespearean sonnet, how Italian sonnet is divided into 2 parts, mainly octave and sestet, whereas Shakespearean sonnet is divided into 4 parts, 3 quatrains and a concluding couplet. Fine. Now, on the basis of this today's discussion, let us have some session assignment. Students, on the basis of today's discussion, you are supposed to answer these 2 questions. Number 1 is write a note on sonnet as a type of poetry, sonnet as a form of poetry. So, you will have to start with the definition and then you will have to talk about the details of sonnets. After talking about the definition, you will have to talk about, you will also have to talk about the types of poetry. After writing about it, the second question of this assignment is that differentiate between the Petrarchan sonnets and Shakespearean sonnets. How Petrarchan sonnet varies from the Shakespearean sonnet. How Italian sonnets are different from the English sonnets. So, while writing answer for this particular question, you have to talk about the form, that is the format, as well as about the rhyme scheme and also about the theme, which we are going to discuss in next few sessions. Fine. Now, let us see what we are going to discuss in next session in the form of precap. Today, we have discussed sonnet as a type of poetry, form of poetry. Now, in the next lecture, we are going to discuss one of the sonnets written by William Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote his sonnets and instead of giving the titles, he gave numbers. Shakespeare never gave titles to his poems, particularly to the sonnets. Instead of giving the titles, he gave the numbers, sonnet number 1, sonnet number 2, sonnet number 3, and so on. Maybe sometimes some publishers, for their convenience, gave first line as their title of the poem, but that was not given actually as a title by William Shakespeare. He simply gave the numbers. So, in next session, I am going to discuss Sonnet 29, this particular poem written by William Shakespeare, and we are going to discuss it as a Shakespearean sonnet. So, whatever the features, whatever the characteristics we discussed of particularly about the William Shakespearean sonnet, those features, those characteristics we are going to apply to this particular poem, that is Sonnet 29, so that you will understand the poem as well as sonnet as a form of poetry. Fine.